This is a traditional frame and panel, made with traditional frame and panel joinery, namely in this case, the stub tenon, which is an excellent option for a frame and panel, and I'm going to show you how to employ that. But it's important to note when making frames and panels, that's not your only option. Boy, howdy. It's going to be one of those days, isn't it? The video's just starting, and I'm already out of coffee. But hey, here we are. Let's talk about frame and panels. Now, frame and panels have been around forever. They are almost ubiquitous in woodworking, and at some point in your woodworking journey, you will make a frame and panel. Whether that's a tiny little frame and panel to go into the back of a cabinet or a big old frame and panel that acts as a door, right? An entryway door is nothing more than a large frame and panel, right? So you will make one at some point. I've made curved, both concave and convex frame and panels in the past. Words are already hard today. But we will sally forth into the unknown and figure out where we're going. The point is, there are variations on how you actually execute the frame and panel, both from an aesthetic standpoint and from a structural standpoint. So what I want to do today is, first and foremost, to make a frame and panel for the cabinet I'm currently working on and show you some variations on how you might cut them in other situations, why you might use them from a design perspective, and also the technique you would use to execute those other frames and panels. Boy, howdy, talking today is going to be, it's going to be a challenge. I can feel it in my bones. It's one of those days. Here's my current situation. This is a tiny little wall cabinet I'm making, and the back panel needs to get glued in back here, which means that given that this is a square-cornered carcass, dovetail joinery on the exterior, and this panel will be stable in here, glued into this spot for the rest of eternity, the joinery that I use doesn't need to necessarily be bomb-proof. So I like to use stub tenon joinery in this situation because it's fast, it's dirty, it gets the job done, and it's structural enough where I'm not going to lose sleep over it. Now, this is a technique I've been using for years because cabinets are, after all, just large boxes. And there's only so much technical variation you can have from a joinery perspective in building boxes. But once you've learned the foundational techniques of cabinetry, you can build just about anything. You can build kitchen cabinets to large built-in libraries to Crenovian-style cabinets on stand. But the question is, where do you learn those foundational skills? Well, many, many years ago, I actually learned them from the Woodworkers Guild of America. Woodworkers Guild of America is your online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information. With premium project videos like building a dresser or informational technique videos like fitting mortise and tenon joints or using a French curve, Woodworkers Guild of America's professional instructors walk you through each technique with step-by-step demonstrations, providing their expert tips and tricks along the way. Now, I can hear you saying, Eric, this is just an ad read. Let's not pretend like you ever actually watched Woodworking Guild of America videos. Okay, all right. Let me paint you a little picture. The year's 2008. There's a young man by the name of Eric in college, living in a dorm room and studying comparative religion, pretending to be a smart individual, all the while dreaming of being a woodworker. And after some internet searching on Ask Jeeves or Yahoo or whatever was available in 2008, he came across a small community called the Woodworkers Guild of America, and he immediately bought this DVD. Yeah, DVDs were a thing that existed back in 2008. Consumed that one, then immediately bought this DVD. Cabinet making, the next level, if that's not pertinent to then immediately bought That's proof that I've been watching these videos for, 15 years. Now, sure, I admit college Eric may have neglected his readings of Thomas Aquinas from time to time, but hey, I ended up here, so all's well that ends well, isn't it? In any case, as a member, you'll have access to Woodworkers Guild of America's live streaming tutorials and Q&As where expert instructors share their tips, answer questions, and engage with the Woodworking Guild of America's community in real time. So, if you want to experience the joy and satisfaction of making something truly one of a kind with your own two hands, check out the link below. The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the description will get a full year of premium membership to Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49. And Thanks to Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring this week's video. So, let's say you need to make a back panel or a front panel. Let's call it the front of a door, as I've done in the past, where that frame and panel needs to bear a little bit more load. It needs to not sag over time. What kind of joinery are you going to use in that situation? Well, I might consider using a half lap, which is going to allow you a substantial amount of glue strength and give you that same aesthetic of a traditional frame and panel. But, what if, say, your carcass is mitered on the outside? Let's say you make a big old square case, and that square case has miters on the outside, and then you look on the inside, and that joinery is square? It might not, it doesn't, aesthetically, the lines don't line, and it doesn't really make sense. So, can you do a frame and panel that has mitered joinery? Can you do a half lap with a mitered joint? Will that give you the same structural rigidity as the half lap, but the aesthetic of a miter? I don't know, let's find out. The answer is, we're gonna do that. The answer is yes. To take a moment and make a little bit more coffee. That's better. Now, right off the jump, I want to focus on the half lap because it's the simplest of the joints to make. You can make it with a standard blade. You can do just a bunch of little nibble cuts. You can also do a speed tenon, which we're not going to get into in this video, but it's a technique I use often. However, in order to get the best joinery, the flattest surfaces, and the most efficiency out of it, I'm going to switch this out for a dado stack. If you don't have one, you don't need one. Don't think that you do. You can, again, make nibble cuts. You can also use a tenoning sled on your fence and make a vertical cut for that one cheek. There's a myriad of different ways and techniques that you can employ to get accurate joinery with this blade. But I have a dado stack, so I'm going to use it.
So early on in my career, I admit I never really wanted to take the time to set up a dado stack. I never felt like I was really getting that time back. I didn't feel like it was necessary. It was just an extra hassle and an extra step. But I admit I've been converted, and I'm largely going to blame my shopmate Larissa for that. I think that she uses the dado stack all the time, and while even on the saw stop there is that extra step of switching out the cartridge, still, in the end, I think that I get a cleaner cut, a better surface, and if I'm cutting more than 4 or 5 joints, then it is a real time saver. So, color me a convert. Here we are. Now, for this particular joint, it's not a dado, it's essentially a rabbet, so I'm not worried about how many pieces I actually put on the stack itself. It's just going to be as wide as it wants to be. But it is wide enough where I can't put the stiffener on there, so I take that off and I put the nut back on, and essentially I'm ready to go. This stack was somewhere in the range of like, I don't know, 5/8, 3/4. I have no real idea, and it doesn't matter because I just need to be able to remove a lot of material quickly and get a flat surface. So after I recoffeed and put the dado throat plate back on, I'm ready to get busy with cutting our half lap joint. Now I've got some scraps sitting around. This is what I'm going to cut these pieces with. And my first move is to set the height of the blade to roughly the thickness of the material. It's not going to be perfect off the jump. I'm just going to guess and see where it goes. This is why we make extra material so that we can do test cuts. And now I'm realizing that I do need to cut this bad boy in half so I can make 2 of them because I'm going to save the other one for the miter joint. But here we are again. Chop it in half over at the chop saw, and now I'm going to make my other cut. So this is where we check to see how accurate our rough measurement was, raising that height of the blade to roughly half the thickness of the material. If I'm low, I'm going to be overhanging as I am right now, so what that tells me is I need to raise the blade up in order to remove more meat off the joint. Now, once I raise the blade up a little bit, I can take a second cut and see where we're at. And in this case, I overshot it ever so slightly. It's close, but it's just a little under, which means the blade is too high, so we're going to be Goldilocks and lower the blade and get it right the third time. So now I'm feeling good, I'm feeling confident. Let's go ahead and get it right. And bada bing, bada boom. Nobody has to know we got it wrong twice. It's good to go. Now, with the depth of cut set and appropriate, all we have to do is set the length of our cheek or the depth of our shoulder, however you want to phrase that. So I like to take a piece and set it on top, give myself a pencil line, and basically just set up the tooth to the pencil line, and then I can dial it in from there. Now you can have a stop on the back or the front of the piece. It doesn't actually matter. If all of your pieces are the same length, then having a stop on the back might be a smarter idea. If your pieces are different lengths, as they are in this case, I would have a long rail and a short stile, or strike that, reverse it. Then it makes more sense for me to set up the stop on the front side of the cut, because that way I can use the same stop for all of my pieces. So now that everything is cut and looking good, and oh yeah, that's satisfying. Now, at the end of the day, this is, of course, a frame and panel and not just a simple half lap, which means in order to put a panel in this piece, we need to have a groove in there. So I just take it back to the bench and bang one out on the plow plane real quick because, you know, why not? And then, after all that work of 10 minutes or so, we have a perfect half lap with a groove for our frame and panel.
Now that is a super sexy joint. It looks great, it feels great, it's absolutely flush. It took no time at all to cut on the dado stack. And you have all of this glue surface right here to create a super strong joint. So that is really bomb-proof. And you can see that there's no real delineation between a traditional mortise and tenon frame and panel and a half lap. So you might ask yourself, what would be the disadvantage to using a half lap? Why not use a half lap for everything? It's quick, it's simple, it has a tremendous amount of glue strength. Well, the moment you cut a plow into this bit of joinery right here, it blows out on the end. Now, listen, does it make any sense for me to cut a half lap joint at the table saw and then use a plow plane to actually make the groove? No, of course not, but I had this dado stack set up on my table saw and I didn't feel like setting it back up to the original blade in order to do that, and I didn't want to set up my router plane, my router table, so hey, here we are. Okay, let's just take a deep breath before we blow up the comment section. But the point is this: the moment you run a through groove in your half lap, you're going to see it on the end grain. Now again, does that matter? If this is going to be trapped in a situation like the back of this cabinet right here, you're never going to see the end pieces because they're going to be housed inside the cabinet. So that doesn't bother me at all. That's totally fine. But if you're using this joint because it needs to be more structurally sound, because it's, say, the front door of the cabinet, then you don't want to see that blown out on the side there. So you then have to create a stopped groove, which is very simple to do with the router table or with some other tools, but it just means it's an extra step. So that's really the only downside to the half lap. Super strong, super simple, aesthetically delightful seeing the end grain wrap around both faces like that. But you're gonna have to do a stopped groove. All right. But what if my case is mitered? What if the exterior of my cabinet has these beautiful miters to them and I don't want to see those square lines disrupting the aesthetic on the interior that I've worked so hard to master on the exterior? How are you going to make a frame and panel with a miter? Because if you just miter the bloody thing together, isn't it gonna fall apart? Well, no, not necessarily. A miter is stronger than you think it is. However, we are going to do some proper joinery in this case and do a half lap miter. So let's dive into that.
Now, a half lap miter is nothing more than a half lap with a miter in it. And one of the pieces or one of the components is a full 45 degrees that's just been undercut like a half lap. So that's where I'm starting at right now. I'm just gonna go to the chop saw and cut it off at 45. You can do so at the table saw before you set up your dado stack if that's your only option. You can cut it at the bandsaw, you can cut it with a shooting board, like whatever makes you happy. That's not the point. The point is, once you have one component at 45 degrees, the process is exactly the same as cutting a half lap. So I am going to make sure that my dado stack is set at 50% of the material, which it already was because I just cut the half lap before. I'm gonna set my fence to the thickness of the material, or the width of the material rather, and that's gonna give me, theoretically, a shoulder that lines up with the bottom of my miter. Now, for the second component, the process is similar but opposite. So rather than cut the piece at 45 degrees and remove the underside of the meat to create the half lap, I'm going to leave it at 90 degrees, but I'm going to remove the half lap at 45 degrees, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to line it up the same way as I did before, and I'm just going to mark my line with a pencil at my 45. And that's going to tell me how much material I actually need to remove. Now again, in theory, you could just do this by lining up the corner of the miter with the outside corner of the piece. That would give you the exact same result as lining up your square shoulder with the underside of your miter. But hey, I like a pencil line, so call me a criminal. I don't know what to tell you. Once I have that set up, then it's just a series of setting up whatever jig or fixture you have. In this case, I have the sliding fence for my sliding crosscut table. So I'm gonna set that up at 45 degrees and use that. You can do the exact same thing with a crosscut sled that goes on top of your table. No difference, 6 in one, half dozen the other, whatever you have available to you and whatever makes you happy. So you can see with our pieces cut and ready to assemble, what you have here is a joint with the aesthetic of a miter, but all of the glue strength and structural integrity of a half lap, which is a rare combination.
Now that's a sexy joint. Honestly, it's got the aesthetic of that miter on the front there. It's got no signs of any kind of joinery on the side, so it looks like a standard miter. Jeez, a miter. And then you have the sign of a half lap right there on the end grain. So it's a delight, and it's not that difficult to cut, as you can see. Once I actually have my components set up for a normal half lap, then it's just manipulating the fence at a 45 degree for one of the cuts. For an aesthetic joint in a mitered case, that could work really well, because again, all of that glue strength that you have from the half lap gives you the rigidity that you might want or need on, say, a door. But you run into the same exact issue if I'm doing a plow on this piece specifically. If I do a through groove, then you're gonna end up seeing that on the end grain the same way that I did with a standard half lap. So you end up having to go through the same process with both of these joints, which is to say a stopped groove. And again, totally reasonable way to approach it, but in this particular instance, when I have no need to worry about structural integrity because this panel is going to be glued in, I'm just going to do my standard old stub tenon because it's the fastest way to do this joint. So let's bang that real one out for this real cabinet. Let's really do it this time. Sometimes you do a thing and you immediately go, I'm an idiot. Who am I? I'm an idiot. That's what happened just now. So I was cutting the stiles for the back panel and making the groove down in the center here. And the very first one that I cut on the wrong side of my stile. Now, you can just not fix it because this is going to get glued into the interior of the cabinet, and like the through groove on the half lap joint, nobody's ever going to see that. But I have my pride of workmanship, and that's going to irk me if I do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is create a little strip. It's going to fit right in here beautifully, and I'll cut it down after the glue is dry in 15 minutes. So no harm, no foul. It's an extra 10 minutes of work, if that. and just enough to keep you humble and remember that you are a human being who sometimes doesn't lay things out properly and you make a mistake. So here we are. The other thing you can do, and Larissa was just making fun of me for not doing this, you could just flip the bloody thing over. Now the reason I'm not doing that is because these two components are book matched because, well, I'm me and I have a tinge of the OCD. Everything else looks great. When I was cutting these grooves, I cut on one side, then I flipped it and cut on the other. It doesn't actually matter how wide this groove is because I know by cutting on both faces that it's exactly in the middle. I don't care what the thickness of that groove is. Really, ultimately, what I care about is that it's centered. Now what I'm going to do is cut the tongues on these pieces in the exact same fashion, meaning I'm going to cut on one face and cut on the other face. And the tongues will be centered, the groove will be centered, so everything, theoretically, unless I cut on the wrong side of the bloody thing again, is going to be lined up and we're gonna have a nice flat frame.
So my first order of business is going to be to repair the goof that I just made, and very simply, I'm just gonna cut a strip that's the width of the groove. I'm gonna do what's called a stop cut. Now, some people are gonna argue that this is unsafe, and you know what? That's fair. It is unsafe, but it's a technique that I've been using for decades. I learned it on job sites. You just cut halfway through, you pull it out, you cut the other half. I'm not recommending you do it, but this is a channel about being fully disclosed. That's not a way to say that. This is a channel in which I want to give you the true ways in which I work and not just perform for the internet. And this is a thing I do often, so take that information at face value, take it for what you will, employ it if you feel safe doing it, don't if you don't. Either way, it's okay. We're all gonna get through this together. Now that I have a nice tight fit after a couple of swipes with a plane, I can just glue this bad boy in and nobody's gonna be any the wiser. It's gonna stick in there forever, I'm gonna trim it down afterward, and we're gonna be just fine. And now that we've fixed my stupid error, we can dive into the point of this video, which is the stub tenon. Now, the process is going to start very similar to the half lap in that I'm just going to guess the height of the blade, make a cut, and see if it fits. And you can see here I'm a little bit loose. So I'm going to lower the blade down, make another cut, and try again. One thing to note is I always lower the blade below where it needs to be and then come up to my final height so that I have the backing of the thread. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but that's just the thing to keep in the back of your mind. And then I can take my practice pieces and set the depth of shoulder. In this case, it's just shy of a ½ inch. And once I have a nice tight fit, then I can go ahead and cut my real components, and they're all gonna get cut exactly the same, so the process takes no time at all. It's just cut, flip, push up to the stop, cut again, repeat on the other side, and repeat for all, in this case, 5 pieces? Yeah, I think it's 5 pieces. Now, I typically cut my panels to the same thickness as my rails and stiles for 3 simple reasons. Number 1, and most importantly, I just think it looks better. I think having a panel that is rabbited and flush with your rails and stiles looks like you put a little bit more care and thought and attention into it, rather than a panel that's flush with your groove. It just kind of looks like you stuck a piece of plywood in there. And there's nothing wrong with that aesthetic. I'm not trying to knock it or say that it's lesser than in some way, but it's just a different aesthetic. And I think having that rabbited panel is a nice way to make it feel like you were really paying attention to the details. But also, from a functional standpoint, it's just easier because I can use the exact same setup as my stub tenons on my panels to cut the tongues, and it just makes life faster if you're smart and you cut your panels to size beforehand, which in this rare instance I actually was. Now, I'll get to point number 3 in a second, but I do just want to point out first this sacrificial fence that I have for folks who are unfamiliar with this technique. This is just a piece of wood that I have clamped to my actual table saw fence in which I can bury the dado stack. So I essentially have a front stop similar to that little block of wood you saw me using with the small components, but it's much easier and safer to use on medium to large scale components like these. Now, while I fine-tune these components with a shoulder plane, I'll tell you about point number 3, which is something I think is vastly underappreciated. Now, because my panels and my rails and my stiles are all the same thickness and they're going to be flush after glue up, that means that I can do all of my sanding after glue up. which makes my life way easier. Number one, when you're dealing with trying to sand small parts, but number two, when you're trying to get that micro fit that's absolutely perfect and something is just a fingernail off, it's gonna drive you crazy. You gotta fit it in with a plane or a chisel. I can just sand it all out after the fact.
Now, if there is a reason why I prefer the stub tenon over the other two methods, is this right here. It's that I can cut my grooves and my tenons, my joinery, and the tenons are going to fill the groove. So there's no exposed joinery, there's no exposed gap in there like you saw in the half lap variations. That also being said, everything is cut to the center. The groove is cut to the center, the tenons are cut to the center, the panel tongues are cut to the center, so everything is based off the center line rather than any actual measurement. I don't care what the width of the material is, the thickness of the material, etc. All I care is that things are centered. So it's a very easy, fast thing to get done, especially when this thing is actually going to be glued into place. It doesn't need all that extra structural rigidity you get from the excessive glue surface of, say, the half lap. Love that big muffler energy. I don't even know how to end this now. So that's that. So there it is. Now obviously it's the next morning. I worked a little bit late on this and I'll let you guys in on a little secret. The door is done, the door is hinged, the box is done. Now it's just the taking all of the components and putting them together in their proper place to get this cabinet done and get a coat of finish on in the next few days is the aim. So I'm gonna get to that this morning. Thanks again to the Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring this video, and thanks to you all for your constant support and kindness. If you guys do want to go support me on Patreon where you can get these videos ad-free, you can find me in the link below at patreon.com/Encurtis. You can also purchase some of my merch in the links below, or go check out my podcast with my friends Paul and Mary, where we talk all things woodworking, design, life, philosophies, etc. But for right now, time to pour another cup of coffee and focus up on this thing. So friends, go get in the shop, go make a thing, and try to enjoy it if you can. And as always, I'll see you next time. Cheers.